Damien Gérard. Very welcome to Digital Markets Research Hub. It's a great opportunity to ask a couple of questions about the functioning of the Belgian Competition Authority, but also beyond, because you have also, in addition to your enforcement role, you've been also in legal practice and also in academia. So you have this 3D or even more perspective on our field, and it's really a remarkable chance to ask a few questions. But maybe we could start with you highlighting your current role and the specificities of institutional setting of the Belgian Competition Authority.
Well, thanks for this. First of all, thanks for the opportunity and your very kind invitation. Very happy to be part of this series. So look, currently, so I act as the so-called Prosecutor General of the Belgian Competition Authority, which means that I oversee the prosecution and investigation services of the Belgian Competition Authority. So if you want, it's a bit the Directorate General. So my team essentially runs investigations, cases, and so because we have this dual structure, so essentially my team investigates, structures the objections, has a first exchange with parties at the level of the statement of objections, and then puts a draft decision to another body, which is called the college, right? Fully independent. So it's made of the president of the authority plus 2 non-permanent members, and they decide, right? So they take the most contentious decisions, big fines in infringement proceedings, phase 2 mergers, or the opening of a phase 2, even non-simplified phase 1 mergers. At the level of the prosecution and investigation body, we can also take a number of decisions. So we take the simplified merger decisions. We also take decisions in commitment cases, settlement cases, but anything that's infringement, goes to the college. And so it's a great, team of about around 60 people now. At least that's the I think the latest head count. And in total, the authority, I think at least with the ongoing recruitment, is count approximately 75 FTEs. So we're still expanding quite significantly. I mean, I think we overall aim to be 80 or 85 probably end of next year, or at least in the coming month, just really to reach this critical mass of people that really enables you to have an effective action. But so my team forms let's say the backbone of the authority. But very importantly, so the most contentious decisions are taken by another body fully independent from us.
And by the way, in a recent podcast with Nicolas Levy, I think you have elaborated on the institutional settings in more detail. But I wanted maybe to ask you, it would be unfair to select a specific model which works best, because I imagine that institutional setting has its pros and cons, and they are rarely separable. But do you think this model which you have in Belgium reflects better the complexity maybe of the situation and the necessity to somehow to divide the labor within the authority itself?
It's a very good question. I think what matters most is that you need to have the institutional setup indeed that matches, the specificities of the enforcement context, that is the local context in which you apply competition rules. And so here in Belgium, what we have as a structure is a copy paste, if you want, of the French model, but in a much smaller country, with also, let's say, less human resources available probably to not only to work on the cases, but also to act, as deciding decision-making body So that is the college I just mentioned. So to be, I mean, obviously I'm immersed into the daily the daily workings of that structure here in Belgium. And I think it could be fine-tuned to make it more effective. I actually think that in France it works quite well, but also, for example, because in France they have a much larger pool of permanent members of the college, right? So not only the president, but you have vice presidents and really permanent members of the college. In Belgium, only the president is permanent members. That's just to give you an example of something that anybody can understand has a direct impact on the collegiality and also on the ability to create an enforcement culture and shared objectives and simply of agreeing on a set of policy principles that you want to apply. And so that's a challenge, I think, in Belgium. And I'm no problem acknowledging that openly. It's a challenge, and so we have to reflect in the future as to how maybe adjusting these aspects to make sure that there is indeed an effective policy that can be carried out by the BCA.
As an academic, my knowledge is quite limited. I hypothesize more than I know the mechanics of things from inside. But I think it's a challenge for each jurisdiction. And not many acknowledge it openly. But I think this, even finding a consensus within the authority on such open-ended concept and selecting the right toolkit, it's really good that you articulate this as a challenge indeed, because I think it's a systemic issue and it's not a problem. Yeah, it's kind of part of a job description in a sense. So I wanted to continue with this kind of different visions, different healthy visions underpinning the maybe enforcement priorities or the understanding of the nature of infringement. You mentioned that you are quite small jurisdiction, but you are in the heart of some meta jurisdiction of large global player. And thus you somehow you are part and parcel of EU law, one of the quintessential parts, I imagine. And so being simultaneously quite compact on one hand and yet part of the broader interinstitutional setting, what does it tell you in terms of the mandate and the ambition of competition policy? Should we focus ourselves on pursuing just step-by-step incremental improvements of markets and by protecting it from instances of anti-competitive conduct, or do we have to go further than this?
Right. Look, indeed, I mean, the Belgian Competition Authority, I mean, the Belgian economy to start with, I mean, in the European Union, even though the country is relatively small in size, in terms of population or size of the economy, it's a bit of it's a mid-sized economy, if you want, in Europe. And it's also one that is very open and very much connected with its neighbors. So, which means also that there are a lot of players who are active not only in Belgium but also in neighboring countries, and so the combined action of the competition authorities in the region is actually, in fact, contributes to effective competition being maintained, across the region. I would say, but it's important that each authority plays its role, and it's important that we probably engage in even closer cooperation, on a number of cases which are by nature cross-border. Now, historically, the Belgian Competition Authority has been totally underfunded, and did not until recently have the resources necessary to actually carry a meaningful, effective action. And a lot of my colleagues who are here since much longer than me, not only acknowledge that, but somehow have regretted that. And for Belgium, the ECN Plus directive has been really a game changer. So in that framework, the government, finally increased significantly and on a structural basis the annual budget of the authority. That enabled us really to start recruiting and building an authority that can be significantly more ambitious now and really fulfill its role. And so we still, in fact, at the beginning of that new phase in the development of the authority, and which means that we are still very much focused on incremental improvements to the functioning of a range of markets, right? And obviously we're trying to prioritize these markets. I mean, by the way, there's probably something quite interesting also from an academic point of view, is that we publish each year our priorities, our annual priorities, right, based on the methodology. And so what I wanted to say is that we do focus on incremental improvements of markets where we identify issues of market power, right? Then within that category of actions, if you want, what we're trying to do is move from a more reactive attitude towards a more proactive attitude, which is already a big change, right? Investing in ex officio capabilities and really try to build cases and not only deal with the cases that are brought to us. So that's what we're really working on now. Now, obviously, if I take the inflation crisis of the past few months, past couple of years, I mean, that's been extremely revealing of the fact that the conduct-based paradigm, which governs essentially competition enforcement, has its limits, right? And that we face and observe structured market structures which are clearly suboptimal across certain value chains, or at least at certain levels, in certain value chains, and both for competition authority but also for political bodies. It's quite frustrating, to get a sense that there is not much you can do, right? And so, obviously, a new frontier in this field, which need to associate competition authorities, but in my view, at least, also democratically legitimized bodies, is about, okay, how can we address structural market failures? When needs be within proper limits, and but obviously that's an open debate. As you know, it's ongoing. Across Europe, Germany has already taken action with its new competition tool. Others are following. Sweden, it's being debated in the Netherlands. And in Belgium we have some sort of tools there, but the toolbox is not yet, let's say, fine-tuned enough to enable actions, at least regular action at that level. But so just to say that we're not there yet, and that's obviously an important debate to have had also at political level. So to cut a long story short, we're still very much focused on, we very much focus on improving, markets as in trying to address issues or abuses of market power, whether they are coordinated or unilateral, on a case-by-case basis.
And you had recently an investigation on high retail prices. So what, and inflation, shrinkflation, different jargon is being used. So what are the main consequences? What are the main conclusions you made, actually, and my implications?
Right. No, indeed. I mean, again, part of this inflation crisis, what we try to do, like many other competition authorities, is to map essentially across a number of value chains, and in particular in the food sector, who are the actors, how the value chain structured, where are the bottlenecks, where is the money actually made and lying, and where are the margins, and so it was more like a mapping exercise to be able to have a better understanding on how the sector is structured, where we should prioritize our enforcement actions, and also just to refine, improve our knowledge and refine our assessment of cases as they arise. And I cannot be too specific, but there is now a very concrete case which is getting to an end, where we could really draw from that study a number of lessons which we could sort of integrate into our reasoning, and that really made a difference in the assessment of an individual case on a product which is very, very popular food-wise in Belgium. So you see that's, I think, the main merit of that study. In addition to the fact that it feeds into, let's say, a broader debate, also with colleagues from the Ministry of Economic Affairs, on the need to review the regulatory framework for a particular sector, in this case, for example, the agri-food sector, and even more so, like the regulation of the interactions between farmers and processing companies, and all kinds of regulations surrounding the food industry. And I think combining the intelligence from different economic regulators, is actually what we should aim at, in order to enable the state to have a useful role to play in the market, also as a market regulator. And it's not about regulation for the sake of it. No, to the contrary, it's to make sure that we have effective but also efficient regulation where it's actually necessary.
So let us continue with this. With you mentioned the Ministry of Economic Affairs. So what are your views, not necessarily from the experience, but more academic, maybe as observation rather than direct reference to the situation in Belgium, maybe some topology. How should we establish effective interaction protocol between the competition authority, which is supposed to be rather technical in traditional canonical sense, and the government, which faces myriad of challenges and opportunities, and which somehow looks at the regulatory toolbox in a much more refined, much more complex fashion? Should we, and obviously we are abandoning this insulation modality, where the more independence, the better, so to say. We understand how anachronistic this logic becomes, but what should it be substituted with?
I don't know. It's a very good question, and it's one that is very topical, also here in Belgium, as we are, essentially changing government. We had elections, a few weeks ago, and a new government will come with a number of challenges. Now, look, I think it's essential that public authorities, cooperate as much as possible to enable the state to have a meaningful action, in general, but even more so when it comes to economic regulation. And it's about having the right, let's say, economic intelligence that can be applied to individual situations, just to make sure that the decisions we take are really anchored into the reality of market dynamics, and that we somehow try as much as possible to close this information asymmetry, which is obviously enormous, with companies acting on particular markets. So I'm a great believer in cooperation between economic regulators, and I actually experience it on a day-to-day basis. We have very close ties with the telecom regulator now since a number of years, and it works. It works when we can draw on the expertise and the knowledge of the telecom regulator, we much more able to have an effective action, as a competition enforcer. So that's really, it's been evidenced in a number of cases, including ongoing cases in Belgium. To the contrary, we have experienced situations where it was much more difficult to, induce other public authorities to cooperate with us. Now, obviously, I understand that at the beginning you need to explain what you do, what's your mandate, why you need that amount of data, why another public authority should essentially ask its staff to spend considerable amount of time to get you the intelligence you need, etc., etc. So I fully understand that. But obviously there can be also tensions across policy areas, which make cooperation a bit more difficult. But even so, I mean, even in full respect of each other's mandate, even if there can be tensions, I think there's so much benefit to be drawn in cooperating in as much as possible. And then obviously the next frontier, and that's one that's been raised, discussed, and implemented in many member states, is to what extent economic regulation should be merged, right? And whether in fact it's more appropriate to have a large body in charge of different aspects of economic regulation that have sometimes very little in common with each other. And I think there are great benefits in terms of obviously synergies from a resource point of view. Take data processing capabilities, IT. I mean, this is so central to any form of regulation nowadays that pooling these resources together makes a lot of sense. But obviously, what you want to avoid is losing expertise. If people are merged into a big body and tend to move around, and so indeed, I mean, so you want to find the right balance. I mean, I think there are quite significant synergies to be achieved by combining probably certain regulators, or at least enable each of them to have the critical size, to have the resources necessary to act effectively. But you probably can achieve also some of these efficiencies by means of cooperation agreements. And for example, we've just entered into a cooperation agreement. That's a scoop, by the way. It's not yet public. We have very recently entered into a cooperation agreement with the Ministry of Finance to be able to tap on their IT specialist to help us carrying down rates. So we're going to have essentially tax officials who are doing like these tax controls in companies, etc. Now helping us in carrying down rates, and they have wonderful expertise from an IT side, and so we greatly believe in mutual in benefiting from each other's expertise and experience. And that's something we definitely both want to implement in the future. But so these kind of things are possible, and so they can achieve to a certain extent the need to pool resources. But there are obviously limits as well. And I mean all these considerations are currently being discussed and debated in Belgium, and so we'll see where we end up in the future. But yes, cooperation is definitely something that any regulator should have high on its agenda, I think.
And Damien, from this answer, it makes me to think that there is no ideal formula, and it all depends on myriad of circumstances, but also on the right people doing the right communication and collaboration with each other, and so it's all about AHR ultimately, rather than just selecting the right model out of possible. And thus my question will somehow be relativized and diminished, because my next question is actually, do you think that competition law in the European Union, competition policy in the European Union would benefit from some changes, additional reforms, however realistic they might be from the grassroots perspective, but from your kind of vision, if such a vision is necessary, but because it doesn't look that it is necessary, it all depends on personalities more than on the architecture itself. But if it still matters, can you please reflect on this?
Sure. I mean, and I interpret your question as being at least primarily focused on enforcement resources and capabilities, and I mean we can discuss substance afterwards if you want, but I do believe that probably one of the next frontier, and as we're talking about reforming Regulation 1 2003, for example, I mean I think something that we really need to discuss and put on the table are the possibility to really integrate investigation teams. So to build joint investigation teams as as possible under for example the Eurojust and Europol regulatory framework. I think there is a lot to draw from those areas. But so, and what I mean is not simply entering into an MOU where you say, okay, we're going to lend you as an expert. No. Really, people, being able to integrate case teams. That is that officials from another competition authorities can issue requests for information. On behalf of the Belgian Competition Authority, for example, or can audition an individual on our behalf, which is currently not possible. Can only carry out investigative actions on behalf of the Belgian Competition Authority, officials of the Belgian Competition Authority, right? And so, but if we were to have a provision in a EU regulation enabling that, obviously, it would be then possible. And I think we should really aim for that. There's so many cases we're dealing with which are cross-border in nature, and obviously it makes very often little sense of duplicating investigations from each side of a border. But obviously each authority also wants to contribute simply to the investigation of the matter in question. So, I mean, I think for me that's really something that needs to be on the table of rediscussion, renegotiation of Regulation 1 2003, aside from many other aspects associated with the digitization of the economy that need also to be reflected in the investigation capabilities and investigation toolbox of competition authorities. So that's one thing. Personally, I see also, and I think it's a good development, and we're trying to really initiate it, is that we probably need to build some closer cooperations among competition authorities of comparable economies within the ECN. The ECN is a wonderful model. It works really well, but it's extremely resource intensive on the part of NCAs and on the part of the Commission. And also it does require for, let's say, mid-sized authorities or even smaller authorities, a huge commitment in terms of resources, which I think somehow can have an impact on the capacity to devote the necessary resource to effective local domestic enforcement. And so I really hope that in the future we can build some closer cooperations with, let's say, authorities of a similar size with similar capabilities, where we would together carry out a number of policy projects and develop our knowledge of certain issues, and where we would be able to exchange much more openly and much more intensely on even basic matters of internal organizations and how we design certain processes, etc. So I think that would be a desirable evolution as well.
when you mentioned the ECN, I wonder what's your impression? I'm hesitating because you not been Belgium is a founding member state of the EU, so it's a core of the EU. But maybe I would be inferring to something, expecting from you some kind of paternalistic vision. But leaving aside these ethical connotations, what are your reflections when you communicate with your colleagues from member states which have joined European Union much later, in the latest enlargement waves? Do you think that you're playing the same symphony, so to say? Do they see? Do they understand the European interest and the European vision of competition policy in the same way, bringing in some incremental added value to this harmonious tool, or there are still some issues which require further synchronization, maybe?
Right. Again, I think the system, and by that I mean essentially the ECN, I mean, works really well. Huh? And it does really help synchronizing the symphony, as you say, even though it put a huge burden on the Commission. Huh? When I talk about the ECN being very resource intensive, I mean also, from the European Commission side. But look, obviously, I mean, there is a huge transformation that has taken place since the 1990s in a large number of now EU member states, and it requires time, 1 or 2 generations, to actually get to, let's say, the same, not necessarily the same level of understanding. That's not what I mean at all. Actually, what I mean is that in applying the framework in the same way, because the issues are then the same. You see, the issues are not necessarily the same everywhere. They obviously are not, and obviously they very much context dependent. So the context being different, obviously the focus of the action is different, and sometimes the interpretation of some concepts can be different as well. But it's not illegitimate. It's just a reflection of the reality on the ground. And I still draw a lot of inspiration from the structure of some NCAs of Central and Eastern European countries. Things that I could only dream of. For example, our colleagues in the Czech Republic are also competent for public procurement. I mean, I would love. I think it would make a huge change, in Belgium if the competition authority was to be also the authority in charge of enforcing public procurement rules. There is a clear deficit of enforcement, when it comes to public procurement in Belgium. And I've made it open in the local media that this is a very huge focal point now for us these days. So you see, there are, in the Czech Republic, they got that competence over public procurement because also after or even prior to enlargement, there was a need to put in place a framework and an authority competent to make sure that the framework in place would function properly. So I think there's a lot to gain by understanding how each other work, how we structure it, and again, I think what we do is so context dependent that you have to factor that into your assessment, into your appreciation also of what the others are doing.
Speaking of public procurement, I recently recorded a conversation with an academic from Bristol, Albert Sanchez Grills, who specializes in public procurement. So I wanted to, and it was kind of a revelation to me that bid rigging issues are by far not the most important competition-related problem. It's more about state aid, and it's often about state aid as well, using public procurement mechanism. So I wonder, in this regard, do you think it would be more appropriate also for the Commission I mean, for the benefits of competition policy more holistically, to have more integrated mechanism of public procurement which would somehow minimize or channel or refine these aspects of the instrument?
It's a good question. Look, obviously, competition authorities, I think, they first of all, to make sure that companies have the right incentives, when they act on the market, and you don't want to. You cannot expect or wish even to review each and every situation which raises an abuse of market power or but that being said, I think there are some structural situations and which are conducive to behavior which are not in line with the incentives that you would expect from businesses. And I think public procurement are particularly sensitive in that respect. So at least it deserves very careful attention on the part of competition authorities, and honestly, to have an effective action there. I mean, some sort of coordination also at EU level in terms of, as it is currently happening, in terms of developing the right, let's say, IT tool to be able to screen, public procurements, etc. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. Now, if your question is, well, the Commission should probably, next to antitrust and mergers and DMA and foreign subsidies, also have a public procurement arm. Look, I'm not entirely sure that this should be necessarily a top priority, at least at that level. But clearly, to address structural, situations at national level, I mean, depending on the magnitude of the problem, you need to have a solution that matches, that problem.
A next ECN-related question concerns the Digital Markets Act. I will also want to of course, ask you and lend your view about more philosophical idea or normative vision of the DMA. But as we already at the ECN, and we understand that the role envisioned for national competition as in the DMA vocabulary, national competent authorities, so going beyond competition, other agencies as well, is important, but the Commission is the sole enforcer yet. We can discuss what it means in practice, but also private enforcement taken into account. But the ECN is positioning its role, it appears to be, to me at least, as a player in this DMA-related setting, not least by trying to be a kind of a channel which absorbs and learns the experiences and the visions of the most prudent, maybe, or most entrepreneurial business users who want to channel their recommendations and their concerns to the Commission, and the Commission has very strong filters for the right reasons. We understand, not asking the question. But do you think that this would be a good solution of hybrid governance, where the ECN would become one of those channels which would communicate processed information to the Commission, using the vocabulary which is understood, using the protocols which are most practical for the Commission?
Right. Yes. No. Your question is very much on point. I mean, I think the national competition authorities have different functions there, and some are more developed than others at this point. So indeed, there is a dedicated ECN group, DMA dedicated ECN group, which so far has acted also a bit as a sounding board for the Commission, while also at national level, domestic rules were being adopted to put in place the framework necessary to enable the support of the necessary support of the Commission in its enforcement role. But I think we're getting there. I mean, most member states have now enacted that sort of implementation legislation, even though it's a probably not the right term from a pure EU law perspective. It's more about putting together the framework that facilitates, if you want, supporting the Commission in its enforcement role. So I think the second phase is indeed that's bringing that support, and that support can be, of course, a function of different aspects. I mean, obviously. Channeling information is one of them. It's a very important one. That's how it's mainly designed, I would say, in the DMA, is that national competition authorities would serve as a conduit to absorb information and knowledge, and then process it, and transfer it to the European Commission. Now, and I would say we're still at the beginning of that phase. And we don't know how much resources it's going to require in the future. But what we see is that we already observe that, let's say, well-organized business organizations, typically business users of gatekeepers, are starting to include national competition authorities in the range of stakeholders they need to reach out to in order to make a point across, to the Commission. And so we have been meeting a number of them, in the recent weeks and months. So we start becoming really a stop for them, in Europe. I think a challenge is to reach beyond those, let's say, relatively well-developed, already international players, and to be able to raise awareness about the opportunities of the DMA with, the domestic or at least regional, tech community or ecosystem. So that's a challenge, but really one, that would actually make a difference, in the sense that, the DMA, the success of the DMA will be largely dependent on how responsive, domestic or local, regional players are, to the opportunities that the DMA offers. And so I have to say we still have a lot of work to do there, to raise that awareness, to create an understanding of what the DMA makes possible. And that's the reason why we are currently, I'm really literally saying currently, so developing this brochure, a small brochure, the DMA, explained, and we subtitled it a short guide for tech challengers, right? And so in 15 pages, not even, with a lot of visuals, distilling the main opportunities offered by the DMA. So the idea is that we would disseminate that very widely here in Belgium, but also beyond, if others are interested. So you see, that's the kind of outreach exercise we absolutely need to do in order to then be able to absorb information and the knowledge that we could usefully contribute to the EU level, to the Commission. And obviously, we also want to make sure that the Commission has sufficient resources. And so, as you know, Italy and the Netherlands and Spain have already entered into MOUs with the Commission to enable the exchange of officials. And we also committed to do that in the coming days or weeks. So that's also part, obviously, of the type of support we want to lend to the Commission. Because what must be clear is that, it has to work. The DMA has to work. I mean, it's such a challenge for society in general today that, we definitely want, and I think, most NCAs in Europe are definitely dedicated to make sure that there is a workable instrument that provides for effective solutions to a number of issues that have been, that are, observable when it comes to the operation of the digital markets. And so, we definitely will invest resources to that end, and are already investing significant resources to that end at our little Belgium.
That's really amazing. and that's it's an excellent opportunity to ask your vision about what ultimately is behind the fairness and contestability as two goals of the DMA, because we see the variety and creativity of the community is remarkable. There are so many different courses you can make out of these ingredients. Some people say that complying with each and every obligation blindly and obediently, that should be the end goal. Others say that obligations are just opportunity, just toolbox, allowing you to focus, prioritize, zoom in, zoom out. Third group would say that, look, listen to business users, they will channel you to the right problems by helping them, you will be restoring the and I imagine they are not in direct conflict, but they are the priorities are not identical, definitely. So how do you see the end goal of the DMA? Not the end goal in 40 years time or whatever, but what should be it aims to achieve?
Right. But look, I think you identified three groups and or three visions, and I could sort of immediately portray, which group, which stakeholders might belong to each of these three visions. So obviously, you start necessarily develop a vision of the DMA that sort of corresponds to, your vantage point and what your position in the system. Now, look, if I may, I just wanted to say a few days ago, Brad Smith, so the president of Microsoft, was here in Brussels talking about AI, and the topic was very much about how to regulate AI, and he said, oh yeah, of course the AI Act is important, and Microsoft policy towards AI is fully consistent with the AI Act. But then when he was pushed, towards, okay, but in terms of economic regulation, market regulation, and then he very candidly said, oh, but we have the DMA. And I was like, the DMA? But for him, he said, but yeah, the principles are there. They are in the DMA. And we can draw, by analogy, inspiration from the DMA, to design or, marketing, slash, commercial strategies, and also technical strategies when it comes to integrating AI with our suite of products and services, and in designing or also essentially in designing our strategy towards AI. And so I thought this was extremely interesting because it shows that apparently, maybe I misunderstood, I don't know, but I think he was very candid about it and very open to say, look, at least we have a piece of regulation that contains, overall principles that gives guidance even beyond its own scope. And I think that's the value. That's one of the value of having such a piece of regulation out there, which is detailed, but at the same time is in fact contains variations around the same overall themes, right? And which themselves draw from the practice of DG Comp and other competition authorities beforehand. So just to say that necessarily you will see certain areas of the DMA which will be more of a focus for enforcement than others. Necessarily, you will see also that enforcement process will be necessarily very dynamic. I mean, I think we will see in the coming months and years that there will be new other designations, and certain obligations will be, let's say, probably more emphasized than others, and will be more stringently interpreted than others. And what's extremely interesting is also the potential, I think, of the DMA to serve really as a template, for guiding, large or less large digital players in the future.
I'm not sure if you refer to the same event, but if it was an event at Serra, I think Vicky Robertson, our colleague academic, made a great job with commenting on different interventions by the CEO of Microsoft. It was really interesting to watch, and obviously colleagues who are interested are happy to are welcome to have to watch this discussion. But I imagine he participated in more than one, probably.
You know, it's the one. That's the one. That's the one.
All right. Yeah, and yeah, I fully agree. The impact of the DMA is really going beyond the letter of law itself. And the elephant in the room in this context, and I don't know how appropriate it would be to ask you, obviously, we're an academic head, of course, the role of courts the Court of Justice of the European Union, they can, if I understand this correctly, they can mute this enthusiasm or pacify the ambitiousness of the regime by looking at scrupulously at some procedural mismatches, etc., or they can give more encouragement, saying, look, as they did with more economic evidences, and given more discretion and flexibility, and or doing something in between, or doing something else, etc. But do you think they? I don't ask you to do crystal ball gazing. What will be their position on the first cases, or if you want, you are welcome. But do you think they are mindful of their decisive role in either wasting all this excitement and energy about the DMA into making it competition law exposed 2.0, or for them, this would be a noise which they have to insulate themselves from, because they are doing adjudication on case-by-case basis, and that's what the role of judiciary is.
Right. Look, my reading is that historically the Court of Justice has been very much, willing to make sure that the legal instruments which it was called upon to interpret, essentially were effectively implemented, right? So could actually effectively reach the goals that were set by the legislature. And so, sometimes and even frequently going beyond the letter of the law, to pursue this theological interpretation to make sure that, a particular provision actually reach, the goal not only of the provision, but of the overall economy of the piece of regulation of which it belonged. And I would fully expect the court to do that as well in relation to the DMA. I mean, frankly, if you take a step back and you extract from the fact that this is a piece of regulation of the digital sector, I mean, from a regulatory, let's say, architecture or regulatory theory point of view, it's an extraordinary piece of regulation. Huh? It's law of the land, across the EU, fully harmonized obligations, centrally implemented by the European Commission. I mean, it's probably the most extreme piece of integration of economic law, of economic regulation, of economic integration regulation that has ever been passed by Parliament and Council at EU level. And I would expect that to be acknowledged by the Court of Justice. It's that the legislature went so far because it deemed the issues to be so important from a social point of view, and so I would expect the Court of Justice to take that into account and to fully acknowledge the far-reaching nature of the DMA and do what it takes within the boundaries of the rule of law to make sure that it achieves its objectives.
I wanted to ask you, and again with a caveat that you are a public official, the implications of the election. We definitely hear this kind of letter report, Draghi, or some elements of the report, and the overall atmosphere saying that maybe it's time for the European Union to become more synchronized and more of its different elements and try to look systemically at digital challenges, looking at the future. There are some industries, maybe some essential digital industries, who have been trendsetters historically or prehistorically, and now we are still in the top tier, but maybe not winning the trophies anymore that often. And the trend is, so supposedly, at least in some industries, is quite self-evident that some other jurisdictions are more skillful, they train their muscles quicker, they adopt quicker, they train their algorithms maybe more ruthlessly or maybe not necessarily. So catalog of different challenges which make many people plea that it's better to be more proactive than not, that it's not as atomistic, no invisible hand-oriented logic, etc. Do you sense this new wave of pro-industrial policy becoming more mature, becoming less eccentric and heterodox, moving towards mainstream? And what should be should the enforcers absorb it, be mindful of it, be navigated by it explicitly, implicitly?
Right. Well, I think it's I find it a positive development, frankly. I mean, it's normal that the European Union is not only conscious, but wants to take the steps necessary from a industrial policy, economic policy point of view to make sure that its economy remains competitive and that the economy really contributes to maintaining the extremely high level of welfare that we have achieved and that the whole world envy us for that. So I think it's very healthy, that we're having this debate, which goes way beyond competition policy. In fact, the leverage is not so much competition policy. The leverages are elsewhere, and I think the Letta and the Draghi reports are making that very clear. But at the same time, I've never understood really this idea that there were definitive trade-offs between industrial policy and competition enforcement, or obvious contradictions or clashes. I mean, I think the benefits of competition remain, independently of the type of, not independently. I mean, they need to be. Competition needs to be part of the design of a properly of an effective industrial policy or economic policy. You're not going to achieve your long-term goals if you try to get rid of an effective level of competition in the sector that you want to invest in. Now, obviously, there isn't a question of scale, but again, it's not a function of changing a market definition, right? Market definition needs to be a reflection of other changes that have occurred or that will be occurring in the near future, and that will enable companies to actually compete on a greater scale. Likewise, I think it's a misunderstanding, a misconception to think that industrial policy means companies needs to be able to merge more easily. But no, there's so much you can achieve by means of cooperation, short of actually concentration and mergers, right? It's largely about putting together a framework that provides the necessary incentive, the certainty, the means for companies to engage into common projects very often. So that's a bit how I see it now. And frankly, when you see the latest Draghi his latest speeches, and you read also carefully the Letta reports, I don't think that there are so obvious inconsistencies or oppositions between what they are actually advocating and remaining or retaining a high level of competition and certainly a high level of effective competition enforcement at EU and national level.
Thank you very much, Damien. The last question before asking for recommendations to students concerns you as enforcer. We hear that competition policy, particularly in the areas of mergers, but not only, become getting more and more technical, and it requires a lot of intellectual resource, professional expertise, in order just to comprehend the processes. And obviously, the room for interpretation is quite generous. Different parties use different toolkits, do different theories, different data, different techniques to substantiate their projection of the future, and this requires a lot of expertise on the side of the enforcers. Do you think it's the race which will continue? Because the stakes are so high, it will continue getting more and more technical, more and more refined, or there would be some point where we will somehow try to narrow it down, or maybe rechannel, recalculate, recalibrate?
Right. I mean, I understand your question as not being necessarily focused or limited, at least, to merger control enforcement, right? No, I actually think that we are at a point where we're probably sort of rebalancing a little bit the evidentiary mix, if you want. I think we need to be able to rebalance or appreciation of the relevant types of evidence and of the individual value, if you want. I think the current debate on the 102 guidelines is very much about that. And also in the merger control area, I think we also observing a trend where we're trying to go back a bit to basics. But by basics, I don't mean, what is often referred to as a formal approach to competition enforcement. Not at all. In fact, what I mean is actually an approach that's very much more attuned with the reality of the markets. That is the interplay between supply and demand, and how in how the interactions take place in the marketplace. I think sometimes, and for probably too long, there was a bit of a confusion between the more economic approach and the fact that everything could be explained by models re-engineering a bit the reality of the market into a lab created by companies and their consultants for the purpose of defending themselves in a particular proceeding. You see, I think we need to move away from that for sure, and make sure that what we basing our assessments on is actual real actual evidence and reproduction of the reality of the market at the relevant time. And that means that we need to be able to privilege much more contemporary evidence, even of non-quantitative nature. I'm a big believer, I've learned that from wonderful people at DJ Comp, in finding and studying, understanding, and using internal documents of the firm. So really going into, I think competition authorities have this rare ability. They are entitled, they are empowered to actually go into the black box of the firm, and that's where the evidence is, and that's where the reality is, and that's where we should extract the relevant element. And the value of that type of evidence, should be recognized as being of a higher nature than even very complex exercises being realized, ex post facto, based on a lot of assumptions about what an as efficient an as efficient competitor, company would have done, back then, or could have done back then, etc., etc. So what I mean is really there's a need, I think, to make sure that we really anchor assessment in the reality. And that means that we base our assessments on contemporary evidence, of a quantitative nature, but also on a more qualitative nature. And yes, I mean, we need to integrate the teachings of economics, and also the progress of all these empirical studies, empirical work that have been carried out over the past 20, 30 years now, and which contain a lot of very useful information about what is likely to happen or not in a particular situation, but not exclusively relying on essentially the ex post reconstruction of a reality on which we have essentially little control.
Amazing. So the last question, Damien, is your recommendation to students. You teach alongside with other activities. You're also an academic in the leading institutions. You see that the demand is increasing very quickly. It becomes less niche. It becomes more kind of headliner, competition law and policy, and many more students would be interested in trying their chances. Maybe you can suggest something which would make give them some additional advantage vis-a-vis other peers with whom they will be competing for these places.
Well, I think an obvious starting point is read cases. Read cases. So don't simply learn about the principles in the abstract, but if you really need, it's an area which is so case specific. These are relatively broad, open-ended standards, right? So if you really want to understand, develop also a judgment, so an ability to really interpret the principle as applied to a particular situation. I mean, you need to read cases and understand, how the principles were applied to the facts, and I think that's absolutely essential. And obviously, when you read the cases, you need to understand also, the context that is also, let's say, territorially dependent. You don't necessarily. I mean, there is always a legal tradition. There is an economy that is structured differently. Relations between economic players, which are also governed by different types of rules or principles depending on the jurisdiction. So I think you need to also develop a sense for the context in which these rules are being applied when you read cases and when you interpret outcomes, and also when you try, and especially when you try to anticipate on possible outcomes, of a particular case. So I think that's absolutely essential. I mean, I think it's also what's very important is that you really develop a sense for and an understanding of what, as a lawyer, of what economics is about, and vice versa. And that doesn't mean becoming a disciple of some particular economic schools, or but simply understanding what economics is about. The science of incentives, what it means, and what are the tools, the main tools being used, and the limits of those tools to try to rationalize, also the legal reasoning. I mean, because necessarily you need to be able to mobilize both, legal concepts and economic concepts if you want to, to understand and to master this field. So I think that's very important if you want to have that edge probably on other students. And then again, is that true for enforcers as for for example a council of companies? I mean, ask to see the evidence, ask to see the internal documents, ask to see the actual basis on which certain commercial decisions were taken. And I think only then you can really give a meaningful advice or can make a meaningful assessment as an enforcer. So the firms know they have the they have the knowledge about how the market works, and obviously over what their strategy is and what they want to what they're trying to achieve. So that's where the basis for a proper assessment lies.
Amazing, absolutely. Damien Gérard, thank you very much indeed for this very informative conversation.
Thanks for having me.